The heat in Crimson Creek was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered sound and slowed movement to a crawl. It pressed down on the dusty main street, shimmered above the warped planks of the boardwalk, and bleached the color from the sky, leaving a pale, tired blue. Inside the small building, marked only with a faded sign that read, "Lynn's Fine Teas," the air was still but carried a different weight, the scent of steamed jasmine, sandalwood, and clean pressed linen. May Lynn moved through the quiet space with a liquid grace that defied the oppressive warmth. Her hands, slender and pale, were never idle. They arranged delicate porcelain cups on a dark wood shelf, folded a square of white cotton with sharp, perfect creases, and brushed an invisible speck of dust from the polished counter. She wore a cheongsam of deep, resonant red, the silk embroidered with subtle, dark gold peonies that caught the light as she moved. The dress was a stark, beautiful anomaly in the brown and gray landscape of the town, a slash of defiant color in a world that had tried to wash her away. It was the dress of her wedding, and the dress of her husband's funeral. It was her armor. From her window she watched the street. She saw everything. The way the blacksmith's dog would seek the sliver of shade by the water trough, the nervous tick in the barber's hand as he sharpened his razor, the weary slump in the shoulders of the women returning from the general store. She observed the rhythm of the town, a slow, predictable pulse that had, over 2 years, become her own. That rhythm broke when the 3 riders appeared at the end of the street. They were not from Crimson Creek. Their horses were lathered and mean-looking, their clothes layered with the dust of a long, hard journey, and they carried themselves with the kind of lazy arrogance that is born from unchallenged violence. The man in the lead, Cole, was broad and dark-bearded, his eyes scanning the storefronts with a predator's casual assessment. To his right rode a wiry man, Finch, whose mouth was fixed in a perpetual smirk. The third, Brody, was a mountain of a man, silent and immense, his presence alone a form of brute communication. They moved through the town's stifling stillness like a disease, and the few people on the street seemed to evaporate into doorways and alleys as they passed. Cole's gaze settled on her window, on the clean glass and the hint of something different within. He saw the flash of red, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. He reined in his horse, the animal stamping impatiently in the thick dust. Finch and Brody followed suit, their eyes following his. They saw a small, quiet business, a woman alone, an easy mark. May Lynn's hands did not stop their work. Finch and Brody filled the doorway behind him, blocking out the light and casting the interior into shadow. The sudden dimness made the red of May Lynn's dress seem to burn with its own internal flame. The scent of jasmine was immediately overcome by the smell of sweat, leather, and unwashed men. For a moment they just stood there, their eyes adjusting. They saw the neat rows of tea canisters, the gleaming counter, the impossibly clean floor. It was a world away from the saloons and dusty trails they knew. It was delicate, it was foreign, and to them that meant it was weak. Finch was the first to speak, his voice a greasy rasp that slid into the room's tranquility. "Well now, look what we have here." He sauntered forward, his spurs dragging a faint, scratching line on the floorboards. He leaned against the counter, his elbow making a dull thud on the polished wood. "A little china doll, all alone." Maylin continued to wipe a porcelain cup with a soft cloth, her movements economical and precise. She did not look at him, but she was aware of his proximity, the way his dirty fingers drummed a restless beat just inches from her own. She could feel Cole's gaze from across the room, a heavy, calculating pressure, while Brody remained a silent, hulking shape by the door, his presence a promise of brute force. "We're thirsty," Cole said. His voice was deeper than Finch's, with a gravelly authority. It was the voice of a man used to being obeyed without question. "Get us something to drink." Maylin placed the cup down, its base making a soft, deliberate click against the wood. She turned her head slightly, her dark eyes finally meeting Finch's. Her gaze was not fearful, nor was it defiant. It was empty of the emotion they expected, a placid, unreadable surface. This momentary lack of reaction seemed to amuse Finch. "Don't you speak English, darling?" he purred, leaning closer. "Whiskey, 3 glasses." "This is a tea house," Maylin said. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried perfectly in the still room. Each word was clear, shaped with a precision that belied any hint of meekness. The simplicity of her statement hung in the air. It was not an apology or an excuse. It was a fact. Brody shifted by the door, a low grunt rumbling in his chest. Cole's smile tightened. He was not accustomed to being corrected, however politely. "We didn't ask what kind of house it is," Cole said, taking a step forward. "We told you what we want." He gestured around the room with a sweep of his hand. "Nice place you got. It'd be a shame if something were to get broken." The threat was plain, delivered with the casual indifference of a man who broke things for a living. Maylin's eyes flickered from Cole to Finch, then to the silent giant at the door. She saw the triangle they formed, the way they owned the space. Her space. She gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod and turned to a shelf behind her. Finch chuckled, a low, satisfied sound. "That's better. She learns quick." They thought they had won. They thought her nod was submission. They did not understand that it was simply an acknowledgment of the path they had chosen. Maylin moved with the same unhurried grace she had shown before, her hands selecting a small, dark clay teapot and 3 matching cups. The men watched her, their amusement growing. Finch nudged Brody with his elbow, a silent joke passing between them. They had asked for whiskey and were being offered a tea party. The absurdity of it fed their sense of superiority. Cole leaned his hip against a small table, crossing his arms over his chest. He was content to let the situation play out, to savor the small-town novelty of it before he took what he wanted. Maylin measured dark leaves into the pot, her focus absolute. She poured hot water from a kettle that had been simmering quietly on a small stove in the corner, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud. The ritual was ancient, calming, a small pocket of order in the face of impending chaos. She was not stalling for time. She was centering herself, allowing the familiar movements to sharpen her senses. She could hear Finch's impatient drumming on the counter, feel Cole's unwavering stare, sense Brody's mass shifting from one foot to the other. They were a storm gathering on her horizon, and she was the calm at its eye. She placed the 3 cups on the counter, their dark glaze gleaming in the dim light. Then she poured the tea, a stream of amber liquid filling each cup without a single drop being spilled. The rich, earthy aroma filled the air, a scent of damp soil and distant mountains. "Tea," she said, her voice as steady as her hand. Finch stared at the small cup in front of him as if it were an insult. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "I ain't drinking that." With a flick of his wrist, he backhanded the cup. It flew from the counter and shattered against the far wall, the dark liquid splashing like a wound against the pale plaster. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet room. The pieces of broken porcelain skittered across the floor. The other 2 cups remained, silent witnesses to the violation. Maylin's posture did not change. Her gaze followed the shattered cup, then returned to Finch's smirking face. A profound stillness settled over her, a stillness that was far more unnerving than any outcry would have been. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with something the men could not name. "You should not have done that," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the tension like a razor. The quiet authority in her tone gave them pause. For the first time, a flicker of something other than amusement crossed Finch's face. Cole pushed himself off the table, his amusement fading into irritation. The game was over. "Enough of this," he growled, starting toward the counter. "We're here for the cash box, and then maybe we'll have a little more fun with the pretty lady." He was closing the distance between them, his shadow swallowing her. Brody took a step away from the door, his hand drifting instinctively toward the large pistol holstered at his hip. They were moving in, collapsing the space, certain of the outcome. Maylin watched Cole approach. She saw the hunger in his eyes, the casual cruelty in the set of his jaw. She saw Finch reaching under his coat, and Brody's hand settling on the grip of his weapon. She saw it all in a single frozen moment. Her own hand, hidden from their view below the counter, rested on a piece of cold, heavy steel. It was a weight she knew well, a burden she had carried from another life, another world. Cole's hand was reaching for her, his grimy fingers spread wide, aiming for the high collar of her red cheongsam. He was 2 feet away, then 1. He saw the flicker in her eyes, not of fear, but of something cold and absolute. He saw her shoulders shift, a subtle economic movement that was not a flinch or a retreat. It was an alignment. Before his fingers could brush the silk, her hand came up from beneath the counter. It was not empty. The pistol was small, a compact revolver with a blued steel finish and an ivory grip, incongruous and deadly in her delicate hand. It did not look like it belonged in this room of porcelain and tea leaves, yet it rose with a certainty that spoke of long acquaintance. There was no theatrical flourish, no shouted warning. Her movement was a single fluid act of will, as practiced and precise as her tea ceremony. Her arm extended, the barrel of the pistol becoming a fixed point in the space between her and Cole. The men's overconfidence had created a fatal gap in their perception of reality. They saw a fragile woman. They failed to see the survivor. Their brains, slowed by arrogance, struggled to process the impossible image before them. Cole's lunge faltered, his expression a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. Finch's hand, halfway to his own gun, froze in place. Brody's immense frame seemed to lock up, his reflexes betrayed by disbelief. The first shot was a deafening crack that tore the room's tranquility to shreds. It was not the booming roar of a frontier Colt. It was a sharper, more contained report, but no less final. The flash from the muzzle was a brief, violent star in the dim light. Cole was thrown backward, not by the force of the bullet, but by the catastrophic failure of his own body. He stumbled a single step, his hand clutching at his chest, as if trying to hold himself together. The surprise on his face was replaced by a look of profound betrayal. He had been the predator, the one who set the terms. The world had just been turned upside axle. He collapsed onto the floor, a heavy, final sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small building. The smell of gunpowder, sharp and acrid, instantly overwhelmed the scent of jasmine. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence, broken only by the high-pitched ringing in the air. Finch and Brody stared at their fallen leader, then at the woman in the red dress. The doll was gone. In her place stood something ancient and terrible, her face a serene mask, the pistol in her hand held as steady as a surgeon's scalpel. It was in that heartbeat of stunned inaction that they lost their lives. They were reacting to a world that no longer existed, a world where they were in control. She was already living in the next one. Finch recovered first, his shock curdling into a snarl of panicked rage. His hand, which had been frozen midway, now clawed frantically for the butt of his pistol. He was a man accustomed to brawling and bullying, his movements driven by brute impulse rather than discipline. He tore the gun from its holster, his knuckles white, his aim clumsy and desperate. He was already too late. Mei Lin did not pivot her body. She simply shifted her wrist, the barrel of her small revolver aligning on the new target. The movement was so minimal, so efficient, it was almost imperceptible. The second shot came less than a second after the first. It was just as precise, just as final. The bullet caught Finch in the throat. He made a wet, gurgling sound, his eyes wide with a final, terrible understanding. The gun fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. He staggered back, his hands flying to his neck, and collapsed against the wall, sliding down to sit in a heap, his legs splayed out at an unnatural angle. Now there was only Brody. The giant by the door had finally managed to unholster his massive dragoon revolver. He was not fast, but he was powerful, a force of nature that relied on intimidation and sheer mass. He brought the heavy weapon up, a bellow of fury building in his chest. He managed to fire a single wild shot. The bullet went wide, splintering the wooden shelf behind Mei Lin and sending a shower of shattered porcelain and dried tea leaves into the air. The destruction was loud and messy, a stark contrast to her own deadly economy. Mei Lin did not flinch. She had not even looked at the damage. Her attention was fixed on the man who had caused it. As Brody fought to cock the heavy hammer for a second shot, she took a single, deliberate step to her left, clearing her line of sight around the corner of the counter. The third shot was as calm and unhurried as the first two. It struck Brody square in the chest. The big man shuddered, a tremor running through his entire body. The dragoon, suddenly too heavy to hold, slipped from his grasp and thudded to the floor. He looked down at the dark stain spreading across his shirt, his face a canvas of dull confusion. He took a staggering step forward, as if he meant to simply walk through the pain, and then his legs gave out. He fell forward, crashing face down onto the floor with a sound like a felled tree. And then there was silence. A profound, ringing quiet that was deeper and more absolute than the tranquility that had existed before. The room was a tableau of sudden, irreversible violence. 3 large men who had walked in moments before as if they owned the world were now just broken things on her floor. The air was thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder and the faint, coppery scent of blood, an unholy mixture with the ghost of jasmine. Mei Lin stood perfectly still for a long moment, the pistol still held out in front of her. Her breathing was even, her expression unchanged. Slowly, as if waking from a trance, she lowered her arm. She looked at the weapon in her hand, its ivory grip cool against her palm. It was a terrible, familiar weight. With a quiet, steady hand, she placed the revolver on the counter. She looked at the ruin of her sanctuary, the shattered cup, the splintered shelf, the bodies of the men who had brought their ugliness into her life. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a deep, abiding sorrow. The peace she had so carefully constructed had been shattered, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it could never be fully restored. The silence that followed the violence was a living thing. It pressed in from the street, seeped through the walls, and filled the space where the gunshots had been. Outside, the town of Crimson Creek had frozen. The blacksmith's hammer was still. The barber's conversation had died in his throat. Every person within earshot was locked in a moment of collective apprehension, waiting for what would come next. Slowly, faces began to appear in windows. Doors creaked open a cautious inch. A few brave or foolish souls edged out onto the boardwalk, their eyes fixed on the door to Lynn's fine teas. They had heard the 3 distinct shots, fired in quick succession. They knew Cole's gang was in there. The logical conclusion was that the quiet little woman who served them tea was dead. A shadow appeared in the doorway of the tea house. It was not a large, menacing shape. It was small, slender, and clad in vibrant red. Mei Lin stepped out onto the boardwalk, into the searing afternoon light. She was not hysterical, not wounded, not even disheveled. Her hands were empty, her posture erect. She simply stood there, her calm gaze sweeping over the faces of her neighbors. The townspeople stared, their minds struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had heard. They saw the woman they knew, the quiet widow who kept to herself, but they saw her framed by the dark interior of her shop, where they could just make out the shape of a man's boot, motionless on the floor. The barber, a man named Henderson, was the first to find his voice, though it was little more than a croak. "Mrs. Lynn, are you all right?" Mei Lin's gaze settled on him. She gave a single, slow nod. The simplicity of the gesture was more powerful than any words. It confirmed the impossible. She was all right, which meant the 3 men who had ridden into town with thunder in their eyes were not. A collective murmur rippled through the small crowd. They took a hesitant step forward, then another, drawn by a morbid curiosity that outweighed their fear. They peered past her into the shop. They saw Cole's body near the counter. They saw Finch slumped against the wall. They saw Brody's enormous form sprawled near the entrance. 3 men. 3 notorious outlaws, known for their ruthless cruelty. All dead. And standing amongst them, untouched, was the small woman in the red silk dress. The whispers began, tentative at first, then growing in volume and awe. They looked at her hands, expecting to see them trembling, but they were perfectly still at her sides. They looked at her face, expecting to see terror or shock, but they saw only a profound, weary calm. The scene made no sense. It defied the natural order of things as they understood it. This was not a story of a lucky survivor. The placement of the bodies, the sheer finality of it all, spoke of something else entirely. It spoke of skill, of lethal, unbelievable precision. While they whispered and stared, Mei Lin turned and went back inside. She did not look at the bodies. She walked to the wall where the first teacup had been shattered. With careful, deliberate movements, she began to pick up the larger pieces of broken porcelain, her actions a small, quiet insistence on restoring order in a world that had been violently thrown into chaos. Marshal Thorne arrived 10 minutes later, his long legs carrying him down the street with a purposeful stride. He was a man whose face had been carved by the sun and whose eyes had seen enough violence to last a lifetime. He was not prone to surprise. But as he pushed his way through the gawking crowd and stepped into the tea house, even he had to pause. He took in the scene with a practiced, methodical gaze. He recognized the bodies instantly. Cole Younger and his 2 associates. There was a bounty on Cole's head big enough to buy a small ranch. Thorne had been tracking rumors of their presence in the territory for weeks. He had expected to find them in a saloon, surrounded by empty bottles and terrified patrons. He had not expected to find them here, laid out like offerings in a quiet, fragrant tea house. His eyes moved from the bodies to the woman. She was on her knees, a small dustpan in her hand, carefully sweeping up the last glittering shards of a broken cup. Her red dress was a pool of color on the floor. She did not seem to be aware of his presence. "Ma'am," Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. It was not an accusation, just an opening. Mei Lin paused her work. She looked up at him, her dark eyes unreadable. She rose to her feet with a fluid motion, setting the dustpan on the counter. "Marshal," she acknowledged, her voice even. Thorne gestured with his chin toward the body of Cole Younger. "Can you tell me what happened here?" She met his gaze directly, her own unwavering. "They came into my home," she said, her words simple and direct. "They would not leave." It was the most profound understatement Thorne had ever heard. He walked further into the room, his boots making soft thuds on the floorboards. He knelt beside Brody, noting the single, clean hole in the man's chest. He saw the massive dragoon revolver lying on the floor nearby. He stood and moved to Finch, saw the wound in his neck. Finally, he looked at Cole. Another single shot to the chest. It was clean work, efficient, almost surgical. There were no signs of a prolonged struggle, no overturned tables, save for the one Cole had been leaning on, no scattered chairs, just the shattered teacup and the splintered shelf from Brody's one wild shot. His gaze fell upon the small, elegant revolver sitting on the counter. It looked more like a gentleman's dueling pistol than a frontier weapon. He reached out and picked it up, feeling its delicate balance. It was a high-quality piece, expertly maintained. He broke it open. 3 spent casings. 3 shots. 3 dead men. He looked back at Mei Lin, who stood watching him with that same unnerving calm. He had been the law in Crimson Creek for 5 years. He knew her as the quiet Chinese widow who ran the tea shop, a woman who was polite, reserved, and utterly unremarkable. The woman he thought he knew could not have done this. "This was self-defense?" he asked, though the evidence was already telling in the answer. "I wished only to be left in peace," she replied. Her voice was tinged with a sorrow that Thorne found more convincing than any frantic claim of innocence. He slid the revolver back onto the counter. The facts were simple. The story the scene told was clear. But the woman at the center of it remained a complete and utter mystery. And Marshal Thorne had a strong feeling that the official report he was about to write would not even begin to scratch the surface of the truth. Thorne stepped back outside, into the wall of heat and the sea of curious faces. He held up a hand to quiet the barrage of questions before they could even begin. "Go on home, folks," he said, his voice carrying the easy authority of his office. "There's nothing to see here. It's over." The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, their whispers following them down the street. The legend was already taking shape, passed from one person to another in hushed, embellished tones. Thorne found Henderson, the barber, leaning against a post, still looking pale. "You see what happened, Henderson?" The barber shook his head, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Saw nothing, Marshal. Heard it. 3 shots, fast as you can count 'em. Then silence. Next thing we know, she's standing in the doorway, and they're not." Thorne nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the tea house. "Did they threaten her? Say anything before they went in?" "Didn't have to," Henderson muttered. "It's Cole Younger. His reputation walks in the room before he does. Everyone knew what they were about. We all just figured—" He trailed off, unable to voice the conclusion they had all drawn. They had all assumed her fate was sealed. Thorne left him and went back inside. The deputy, a young man named Peterson, had arrived and was looking at the scene with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Get them out of here, Peterson," Thorne instructed quietly. "Take them to the undertaker, and be respectful. In here, I mean." He didn't want the boy clomping around, disturbing the strange sanctity of the space. Peterson nodded, swallowing hard, and went to fetch help. Thorne turned his attention back to Mei Lin. She had retrieved a bucket and cloth and was now wiping the dark splash of tea from the wall. He watched her for a moment, struck by her focus on this small domestic task in the midst of such carnage. "That's a fine weapon, ma'am," he said, nodding toward the revolver on the counter. "Not something you see every day." Mei Lin paused, her hand stilling on the wall. "It was a gift," she said, her back still to him. "From my husband." The simple statement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Thorne had known her husband, Mr. Lin, a quiet, scholarly man who had died of a fever the previous winter. He had been a kind man who taught some of the town's children how to read. He did not seem the sort to own such a weapon, let alone gift it to his wife. A new picture began to form in the marshal's mind, one that connected the quiet scholar, the exquisite weapon, and the woman with impossible skill. Perhaps Mr. Lynn had not been just a simple teacher, and perhaps his wife was not just a simple widow. "He taught you how to use it?" Thorne asked, probing gently. She turned to face him, her expression giving nothing away. "My husband taught me many things, Marshal. How to be patient, how to be still. He taught me that the most important things in life are worth protecting." Her words were a carefully constructed wall, offering an explanation that revealed nothing at all. Thorne understood. He was being told, politely but firmly, that her past was her own. He had the facts he needed for his report. 3 known outlaws, dead. A clear case of self-defense. The town was safer tonight than it had been this morning. That was the job. The rest of it, the story behind the woman in the red dress, was not his jurisdiction. He tipped his hat. "I'll need a formal statement down at my office tomorrow morning. Just a formality." She nodded. "I will be there." As he left, he knew that the story of this day would be told in Crimson Creek for 100 years, and he suspected that none of them, himself included, would ever truly know the whole of it. After the marshal and his deputy had gone, after the heavy bodies had been carried out, leaving only faint impressions in the dust on the floor, a different kind of silence returned to the tea-house. It was not the peaceful quiet of the morning, nor the ringing void that had followed the gunshots. It was a heavy, somber stillness, thick with memory and consequence. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. A single ray of golden light cut through the window, illuminating the floating dust motes and the dark, ugly stain on the floor where coal had fallen. Mei Lin stood in the center of the room, looking at the stain. It was the last physical trace of the men's presence, a violation that soap and water alone could not erase. She fetched the bucket again, this time with a stiff bristled brush. She knelt and began to scrub the floorboards, her movements methodical and tireless. The work was hard, her muscles aching with the effort, but the physical exertion was a welcome distraction. It anchored her in the present, keeping the ghosts at bay. As she cleaned, her mind drifted back, not to the violence of the afternoon, but to a quieter time, a different place. She remembered a garden enclosed by a high stone wall where the air was sweet with the scent of gardenias. She remembered her husband, Gian, his hands not holding a book but guiding her own as she held a pistol for the first time. He had not been a violent man, but he had been a pragmatic one. He had been a guardian, a protector, a member of an old order that had been swept away by changing times. "Peace is a beautiful, fragile thing, my love," he had told her, his voice gentle but firm. "It is a garden we must tend. But the world outside the walls is full of weeds and pests. Sometimes, to protect the garden, you must be willing to pull the weeds. You must do it quickly, without anger, without hatred. You do it only to preserve the peace." He had given her the pistol on their wedding day. "I pray you only ever use this to admire its craftsmanship," he had said, his eyes full of love and a deep, world-weary sadness. "But if the day ever comes when the walls are breached, I want you to have a tool to defend the life we build." They had come to America to escape that world, to find a place where the walls were no longer necessary. They had found this small, dusty town and built a life of quiet anonymity. Gian had become a simple teacher, and she a purveyor of fine teas. They had tended their new, small garden. But when the fever took him, it had breached the first wall, and today the weeds had come. She scrubbed harder, the friction of the brush against the wood a raw, rhythmic sound. She was not angry. She was not triumphant. She felt only a profound, hollow grief. Grief for the men who had forced her hand, yes, but a deeper grief for the promise she had been forced to break. She had used the tool. She had pulled the weeds. But in doing so, the peace of her garden had been irrevocably trampled. The floor was clean, the stain faded to a dull shadow in the wood, a permanent scar. She rose, her body weary, and carried the dirty water outside. The sun had set, and the sky was a bruised purple. The air was finally beginning to cool. Her work was done. Her sanctuary was clean. But it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a fortress, and she, its solitary guardian. As twilight settled over Crimson Creek, a new social order was quietly being established. The residents, sitting down to their evening meals, spoke of little else. The story of the day was repeated, embellished, and transformed. The quiet Mrs. Lynn, the pitiable widow, was gone. In her place, a new figure was emerging from the crucible of their collective imagination. The dragon widow, the lady in red, the silent woman who had faced down 3 hardened killers and had not even blinked. Her tea house, once a quaint curiosity, now became a landmark. People walked past it slowly, their gazes lingering on the door, as if the building itself now possessed a mysterious power. They noted the soft lantern light glowing from within, and imagined her sitting there, alone, a figure of mythic proportions. They did not fear her. It was something closer to awe. The fear they had felt for Cole Younger's gang was a primal, understandable thing. It was the fear of the wolf at the door. The feeling they had for May Lynn was more complex. It was the disquieting respect one has for a force of nature, for something that operates by a different set of rules, something that is both beautiful and deadly. Marshal Thorne sat in his office, the paperwork for his official report spread out before him. He wrote down the facts as he knew them. Cole Younger, Finch, and Brody, all wanted men, entered the establishment of Mrs. May Lynn. An altercation occurred. Mrs. Lynn, fearing for her life, discharged her firearm, resulting in the deaths of all 3 intruders. The shooting was ruled as justifiable homicide. It was all true, and yet it felt like a profound fiction. The words were sterile, clinical. They captured none of the impossible stillness of the woman, none of the shocking efficiency of the violence, none of the lingering mystery that now hung over the town like the evening mist. He leaned back in his chair, the pen still in his hand. He thought of her husband, the quiet scholar. Had he been a guardian in exile? Had he trained her, preparing her for a day he hoped would never come? The pistol, a gift from him, was now the instrument of her legend. Thorne had a feeling that Gian Lynn would have been both proud and heartbroken. Late that night, long after the rest of the town was asleep, Thorne took a walk. He found himself standing across the street from the tea house. The single lantern still burned, a solitary point of light in the darkness. He saw her silhouette pass by the window, a graceful shadow moving through the quiet house. He thought about knocking, about asking the questions that his report had left unanswered. Who are you? Where did you come from? But he didn't. He knew she would not answer, and he knew he had no right to ask. Her privacy, her peace, was the very thing she had just killed to protect. He turned and walked away, leaving her to her solitude. He had done his job. The law had been satisfied. But a new, unwritten law had been established in Crimson Creek. It was the law of respect. The tea house was no longer just a business. It was a territory, and its borders were now guarded by the memory of 3 gunshots and the quiet dignity of the woman who had fired them. The peace she had lost in the violence of the afternoon was slowly being replaced by a new kind of peace, one forged in respect and born from the town's collective awe. It was not the life she had chosen, but it was the life she had earned.